Okay, good morning again to everyone. As you can see printed in your bulletin, the title of my message is a very familiar one, a familiar theme of David and Goliath. We're looking at the whole 17th chapter of 1 Samuel. I'm not going to read all the text, it would just get too lengthy, but we'll go through it as we go through the message. Before I get into it, I just want to say thank you to anyone that's watching by YouTube from the Mississippi Baptist. They sent me a brand new suit, and I really like my new suit. Thank you for that. So we're going to look at chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, verses 1 through 50. As an open today, there was an archaeologist some years ago that was digging out in the Negev desert in Israel. And as he was doing his excavations, he noticed a casket. He found a casket containing a mummy. And after he examined it, he called the curator of a quite prestigious natural history museum, and he said, "Sir, I've just discovered a 3,000-year-old mummy, and the mummy died of a heart attack." And the curator said, "Really? Well, bring him in and we'll check it out." And so a week later, the curator was amazed because he realized, that this archaeologist was right. And so he called the archaeologist and he said, "You're right about this mummy's age and even his cause of death. And how in the world did you know that he died of a heart attack?" And the archaeologist said, "Well, it was real easy. There was a crumpled piece of paper in his hand that said 10,000 shekels on Goliath." Now, this story of David and Goliath that we see here in the 17th chapter of the book of 1 Samuel might be, for some of us, the most favorite, maybe our favorite Bible stories of all time, really. One of the greatest. Probably everybody that goes to church or even has a passing interest in biblical things knows the story of David and Goliath. It might not be my favorite, but it's right up there with my favorite story of all the Bible. It is, of course, one of the best known, and even I would say maybe the most inspirational of all the stories. Everybody loves a good story where the underdog wins against all odds. And that's exactly what we see in our text today in the 17th chapter of 1 Samuel. Now, Goliath had all the things that would normally impress and intimidate people. David knew something that no one else noticed, and that is, in this time of crisis, no matter how big the giant was, that might be, that no matter how powerful he might be, that David had a concept, even though he was smaller, that he had an idea and understood what we should understand, and is that God is greater. God is more powerful in all of the things that we come up against. That when you and I stand for God, God's enemies should be scared. God's enemies will be defeated. Now, with that in mind, I want us to take a look at the battleground that we're witnessing here in this text in the 17th chapter of 1 Samuel. If we look at verses 1 through 3, and I would encourage you to read along with me, it says here in verses 1 through 3, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley in between. The valley of Elah was more like a vast canyon in reality." Now, I didn't understand this when the other times that I've looked at this passage, but there was a very wide canyon between these two mountains where we have the Philistines on one side and the Israelites on the other. This canyon, this valley, was about a mile wide. So it's quite a distance there. So on one slope was the army of Israel, and on the other slope, on the other side, was the Philistine army, if you can feature that in your mind. So let's consider this morning the major characters in our text here that we're looking at in Samuel. First, there was Goliath. Now, he had a size and he had an appearance that were really, really impressive. And the writer goes into quite great detail in this chapter to describe him and how he was physically. In verse 4 it says, "And the champion," this is Goliath, "went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span." Now, we don't use cubits and spans in today's measurements. But if you were to take that measurement and compare it to feet and inches today, Goliath stood about 9 feet, 9 inches tall. An enormous man, huge man. He was standing on his tiptoes. He would probably stand higher than 10 feet. He could probably reach up to 13 feet in the air, if you can feature that in your mind. Goliath was a big man, but it wasn't just his size. If we look at verses 5 through 7, it tells us how he was arrayed for battle, how he was outfitted for battle. It says he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. Now, a shekel is a measurement of weight. And he had a bronze armor on his legs, as it says, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear, it says, was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. And a shield bearer went before him. To put it mildly, as I've already alluded to, Goliath was dressed for battle. He was ready to go to war. His body armor weighed between, if you convert it over, between 175 and 180 pounds. So it was a little heavier than my weight, my body weight, that he wore for armor. But Goliath also wore a bronze helmet, and he had bronze leggings, or what they call greaves, and these were used to protect his shins, and he carried a bronze javelin, or a spear, that was slung between his shoulders, if you can feature that. Now the head of this spear alone, it tells us in our text, that it weighed 600 shekels of iron, or about 20 to 25 pounds. That was the head of his spear. He also had a shield carrier who walked before him. Now, this shield carrier was probably a normal sized man walking before this great big giant, just for a little extra protection. A little bit of protection here. Now, Goliath was, we can assume and realize that he was a very battle-hardened warrior. He probably had killed countless men in his military career. Probably been bloodied a few times himself, but he would always come out victorious. So now, with that in mind, with this backdrop in mind, can you imagine how frightening it would be to take on Goliath in a battle of life and death? Now that beam right there is about 9 feet tall. It's a little, he'd bump his head on that beam going through there. Very likely might have. Can you imagine going up against a man like that? Even if you're big and strong and tough. It would be frightening, wouldn't it? The odds would not be in your favor in any way, shape, or form. Now notice what this warrior did in verses 8 and 9. He stood and he shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, this is coming across the valley that they are standing across on 2 different mountains, if that makes sense. He says, why do you come to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine and you the servants of Saul? So he's kind of taunting them. He's needling them here. Choose a man for yourselves, he says, Goliath says, and let him come down to me. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel. And he said to them, why have you come out to line up in battle? Excuse me. Am I not the Philistine and you the servants of Saul? So he's kind of needling them. We're Philistines and you're just Israelites. You don't really count. Choose a man, he goes on to say, for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants. Goliath proposed a practice that was pretty commonly used in the East at that time. And it was a one-on-one fight, winner takes all. Sounds like a pretty good deal for somebody. Now Goliath proposed to fight whoever Israel would bring up against him. And if Goliath won, the Philistines would capitulate to the Israelites. But if Israel warrior lost, then the Philistines would be the winners. Now Goliath had no problem with confidence. Well, if you're a 9 foot 9 inch man, it would give you a little confidence. It would. He says, bring it on. Let's go, you cowards. I'll fight you. That's what he's saying to the Israelites. Goliath didn't issue this challenge once and just leave it. His challenge went on, we see here in the text, if you read the whole scripture, went on for 40 days. 40 days. He comes out, he screams across the valley to the Israelites, and he says, come on, you weaklings, you cowards, I'll take you on. Every morning and every evening for well over a month, he marched out there daring someone to take him on. And that is similar to any, I think we can take that and put that in a little bit of application here. That's like any giant that you're going to face in your life. Worry and fear don't just come once and then leave us, do they? Sins and addictions don't just hit us once and then leave us. Anxiety just doesn't make one visit. They come and they come and they come, and sometimes they just torment us in our day-to-day lives. The fears, the worries, and the sins that we go through in our day-to-day lives, they torment us. They come and they challenge to fight us and fight them under our own steam, our own strength. They provoke us to believe that we can't handle it. I can't overcome this. I can't win. The only thing I can do in this situation is lose. That's what these giants in our lives do to us, somewhat like Goliath was doing with the army of Israel. Those giants want us to believe the lie that we are on our own and that we will die trying and that we'll never be victorious. And then here comes David. Skinny little David comes along. He's out tending the family sheep. He didn't even go to battle. He was still a kid. And this Bethlehem's probably 10 or 15 miles from this battle site. He was too young to fight, as I said. He probably had never even heard of this guy named Goliath. His 3 older brothers were out fighting Saul's army, and David's father was at home wondering how was everything going on in this battle over in the valley. If you look at verse 17 and 18, it says, then Jesse, this is the dad, this is David's father and these 3 brothers' father. Jesse said to his son David, the one out tending sheep, take now for your brothers an ephah of dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brother at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their thousands, and see how your brothers fare. Bring back news of them. Now David was emphatically not going there to fight anybody. He's taken some bread and some cheese out to the army. That's all he's going for. That's what his dad asked him to do. And he was basically also going out there to check on the well-being of his brothers and the rest of the army during this time. So in verse 20, we see how David responds here. It says, so David rose early in the morning after his dad said all this. He left the sheep with a keeper, and he took the things that Jesse had asked him to do, and he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight, and shouting for the battle. As David gets to the edge of the Israelite camp, he sees the troops. And this has to be more exciting, I would say, than watching sheep on the hillside where he just come from. And then we go to verses 22 and 23 here, and it says, and David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper. So he takes his cheese, his bread, and he leaves it with the cook, or the guy that doles out the food. He ran to the army and came and greeted his brothers, and then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. So here's David. He doesn't know what's going on. He's doing what his dad told him. He's taking some cheese and some bread out to the battle. And here's this giant blathering and spouting off, and David heard them. He's standing there, he's talking to his three brothers, and when all of a sudden he hears yelling from this Philistine, this babbling on of this Philistine warrior. And he's thinking, what's going on here? And suddenly everybody around him is rushing about to get to the rear, to climb over one another, to get away from the possibility of this guy coming at him, this Goliath. Now, if you look at verse 24, we see there, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. And so David is witnessing this. And Goliath has been challenging Israel by this time for about 40 days. That's over a month. But this is the first time David heard the challenge that Goliath had. And everyone around him starts to run and hide, and David's saying, well, what's going on here? Not one person in the whole Israeli army was willing to stand up to Goliath. That's the long and the short of it. So David sees Goliath just like all the other guys did. And there is a giant. He's armored. He's a warrior, very obviously. He's shouting threats. He's cussing God. And David couldn't take it. David gets a little bit of testosterone going on here. And he gets a little ire up. A little of that red hair coming out. Everyone else sees an enemy that they can't defeat. They can't overcome. But David sees an enemy that God can defeat. It makes me think about that Popeye. The Popeye story where Popeye gets pushed around, and finally he says, I can't take it no more. And he gets the can of spinach and he pops it open and he eats the spinach, and away he goes, beating up people, taking on the enemy. And I think that's kind of how David was doing here. No one's going to talk that way about the God of Israel as long as David's around. So why is everybody running away? That's what he's wondering. These guys are big, they're strong, my brothers are bigger and they're stronger and better looking than I am. Why are they running away? Why doesn't somebody just go kill that big giant? A little side note here in church, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in all of our churches. And a lot of times we're waiting for someone else to do it. I wish somebody would start a class. I wish somebody would do something. Wouldn't that be nice? It might just be that somebody that needs to do the work is you or me. It's us. Now, David was not impressed, nor was he intimidated. And the reason I say that is look at what he does in verses 26 and 27. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? I mean, he's mad. He's like really mad. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, So shall it be done for the man who kills him. Here's what the king Saul promised to the guy who kills Goliath. Great riches. He promised his daughter's hand in marriage. He promised to be exempt his father's house from paying taxes. Those were all external motivations that had no influence on all the other men in the army of Israel. Don't matter about the girl, the money, or anything else. I'm scared. They didn't motivate anybody to do anything. You see, Goliath has come down his side of the hill. He's crossed that ravine, and he's coming up Israel's side. So here's the deal. You see, if you tolerate a Goliath in your life, and we all have them, we all have things that are bigger than us, that seem like they're 9 feet 9 inches tall. What he'll do if you let him, he'll take over your territory. He'll move into your camp. He'll take your thoughts that normally ought to be on God, and he'll put them on himself. And that's why you can't afford to tolerate the giants in your life. You got to kill them. You got to kill them. Now David's oldest brother, Eliab, he takes a jab or two at his younger brother. Now Eliab, if you remember, when when Jesse parades all the boys by Samuel about who's going to be the new king, Eliab didn't raid. Not with Samuel, not with God. He was tall, yes. He was good looking. He was the firstborn son of Jesse. He was the one that God passed over in favor of David, if you look at verse 28. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the man, and Eliab's anger was roused against David. And he said, Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left these few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, he says to David, for you have come down to see the battle. So we can see that Eliab is not happy to see David, and he asks, Why are you here, and what do you want? What do you want? Who's washing the sheep? Sheep boy. I added that last part myself, the sheep boy. Sheep boy. Eliab was inviting a fight. But David, you see here, he didn't answer. He didn't come back and start a stink with his brother. He just ignored it, as far as we can tell. This wasn't a battle worth fighting for David. And next we find King Saul and David are talking in verses 32 and 33 of our text. Then David said to Saul, that's the king of Israel, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go out and fight this Philistine. And Saul said to David, You are not able to go against the Philistine, this Philistine, to fight with him. You are just a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. David isn't scared of Goliath, and he says, I'll fight him. Now, Goliath's appearance was impressive. There's no doubt. I've already laid that out. But David, the little man that he wasn't a big man at all, he had more faith in God than he had in himself. He had his confidence not in his ability, but in God's ability. Remember always that God looks at the heart. He looks at the heart. If you go back to chapter 16, which we didn't have in our text today, it says, But the Lord said to Samuel, Do not look at his appearance or his physical stature, when he was picking a new king, if you remember that story. Because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. David was, we know, a man after God's own heart. The scripture says that very plainly. God's heart and David's heart walked step by step. Was David perfect? No. David made a lot of mistakes. He sinned in his life. But did he walk with God? Yes, he did. He knew that God had all power in heaven and earth, and he was willing to stand on that power. And because of that, David knew that God was able to do mighty things with a not so mighty man. Anybody could see that Goliath could smash David like a bug. He didn't have a chance physically. But what they couldn't see is with God, not enough becomes way, way more than enough. David says to himself, if I'm on the God side, I can't lose. That's confidence. That's real confidence. David then described to Saul how in the past that God had proved himself faithful. You remember when David slew a bear and a lion. If we look at verse 37, he says here, he's talking to Saul here in verse 37, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. We need to remember what David kept on his mind. That God has been faithful to me in the past, and because of that, he will be faithful to me in the future. And he will keep on being faithful to me. God has saved me from certain death with lions and bears. God brought me this far. It is God who has sustained me. You see, when your giants call your name, remember that God loves you, that God is your strength. You are not alone when you walk in faith in Jesus Christ. You're not alone, ever. David basically says, I can defeat Goliath by God's strength. It was God's strength that saved David from those lions and those bears, and would give him power over this Goliath also. Saul says, go, and may the Lord be with you. He's going like, whoo, go ahead and go. And he's thinking in his mind, you know he is. The wheels are turning. He's going to be mincemeat out on the battlefield. And then Saul tried to get David to wear his battle gear, if you remember that. It wasn't how David was used to fighting. He didn't have battle gear when he went up against the lions and the bears out with the sheep. David didn't have a chance to test this battle gear that Saul had. But it didn't fit anyway, and it probably wouldn't work for him. You see, David just put his own clothes on. He picked up his sling and his staff, and he went out to do battle with what he knew how to do it with. He did what he could with what he knew would work. And then comes that crucial moment we see in verse 40, where it says, then, talking about David, then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistines. The beautiful thing about this story is that it's a perfect example of how you'll see God operate. He magnifies his name when we're weak. If we're strong and we can do it ourselves, guess who gets the glory? We do. We brag ourselves. But if we do something and they go, wow, he couldn't have done that on his own, then God gets the glory. We don't have to be eloquent. We don't have to be strong or handsome. We don't have to be beautiful or brilliant or have all the answers to be blessed by God. You can write that down. You see, what he does is he honors our faith. All he asks us is that we what? Trust him. Trust him. That we stand before him in integrity and in faith. And he'll win the battle. Not us. He doesn't. You see, God is just waiting for his moment, waiting for us, you, me, to trust him. So he can empower us to battle our giants in our day-to-day lives. Goliath is still large and he's dangerous. He's still ready to kill anyone who comes to him. The threat for David was real. Yes, it was. But we need to remember, as he did, that simple faith is powerful in the face of real giants. David needed God, and he didn't need anybody else. He didn't need Saul's armor. He didn't need a spear. He had his sling, and he was ready to go. And he had God. So after picking up the stones, he comes up and he approaches this gigantic Philistine warrior. This shepherd boy made the giant just smile. He's just grinning at this little kid, this young teenager. Goliath thinks it's a big joke. If you look at verses 41 through 46. So the Philistine, Goliath here, came and began drawing near to David. And the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" He's really spreading it on here. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." That would put a little spook in you, wouldn't it? But here's what David said to the Philistine. And then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and with spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." Wow. He's getting tough with this big guy. You see, David was able to stand before this great big giant, unintimidated. And it wasn't, I want to say it again, it wasn't that Goliath was not a threat. He's big and he's tough and he's mean and he can tear you to pieces. He was a threat. But it was that David had more faith than he had in God. He had more faith in God than he had fear of Goliath. That's the long and the short of it. Certainly, we live in uncertain times. We can write that down, and you all know that. You take it on the political front, religious front, social front, every which way you go, we're in uncertain and difficult times. And sometimes if we're not careful, we can be intimidated by the fear of the future. There are real threats to each one of us. I don't know exactly what your threats are, but I have mine. I know what mine are, and you know what yours are. But we must have more faith in God than we have that of the fear that's within us, that's holding us back. To be giant slayers, we got to look the giant right in the eye. And we got to say to ourselves, this is the big scary problem, and I can't handle this. But my God can handle this, and I will trust him. David had invincible confidence in God. And we see, and the reason I say that is we look at verse 47, where he says that all this assembly may know the Lord does not deliver by sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's. There it is. There's the burden of my message this morning. That's the secret of David's life. The battle is the Lord's. We must fight our battles God's way. God is saying to you this morning, he's saying to me, when I point my finger, I got 3 pointing back. You do it my way, and I'll honor you. You do it your way, and you're doomed to fail. The battle is mine, God says. David, what did he do? He just ran down to meet Goliath. The way I read it, it says that David would have just killed Goliath, But he needed to make a point first. And the point is that the battle, as I said, is the Lord's. David made it a point to put the pressure and the glory on God. David made it a point to put the pressure and the glory on God. Now, if you look at verses 49 and 50, we're winding up the message today. Then David put his hand in his bag and he took out a stone. Remember, he put 5 in there. And he slung it and he struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. David went after Goliath, not with his own limited power, but with the ultimate unlimited power of a limitless God. Whoosh, 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 and this stone flies through the air. And it strikes Goliath right between the horns. And he knocks him to the ground. And then what did David do? He takes Goliath's sword. Probably took both hands just to pick it up. And he cuts that big head right off his shoulders. And he destroys that giant right there in that valley. Because of God's power in David, an unwinnable battle was won. An undefeatable enemy was killed. A little faith went a long way. A little faith could go a long way for you and for me too, if we're willing to take and exercise that faith. So if God has spoken to you today in any way, you do what God calls you to do as we stand and sing a hymn.